Let's go to Psalm 81 today. Psalm 81. And let's read the first 7 verses. It says it would be a psalm of Asaph, according to the heading. Sing aloud unto God our strength. Make a joyful noise unto the God of Jacob. Take a psalm and bring hither the timbrel, the pleasant harp with the psaltery. Blow up the trumpet in the new moon, and, in the time appointed on our solemn feast day. For this was a statute for Israel, and a law of the God of Jacob. This he ordained in Joseph for a testimony when he went out through the land of Egypt, where I heard a language that I understood not. I removed his shoulder from the burden, his hands were delivered from the pots. Thou callest in trouble, and I delivered thee. I answered thee in the secret place of thunder. I proved thee at the waters of Meribah. Selah. These first 7 verses deal with Israel praising God in its feasts for deliverance from Israel. Notice verse 5. It says, This he, God, ordained in Joseph for a testimony when he went out through the land of Egypt. That's the angel of death and all the firstborn. When I heard a language that I understood not. The writer of this psalm switches from the third-person voice to the first-person voice very abruptly, without any warning. Fasten your seatbelt when you're reading this. And then just as quickly he puts Israel into the third-person position with God speaking about them. In verse 6, I removed his shoulder from the burden, his hands were delivered from the pots. And then hold on, God now speaks directly to Israel in the second-person position, verse 7. Thou callest in trouble, and I delivered thee. I answered thee in the secret place of thunder. I proved thee at the waters of Meribah. Selah. So the writers and prophets will often switch back and forth from first person speaking, sometimes second person speaking about Israel, sometimes speaking as God, directing his words to them about Israel, or sometimes God directing his voice to the nation itself. All written by many times the same writer, and especially in the prophets. Verses 1 and 2 are self-explanatory. The solemn feast day, verse 3, is no doubt the Feast of Tabernacles, and thus it will date the beginning of Christ's second advent, his visible earthly reign one day. I want you to compare the language of other very similar texts, so let me have you turn to a few places. Go back to 2 Chronicles 7. 2 Chronicles 7. That's in the Old Testament, right after the book of 2 Chronicles 6. 2 Chronicles 7, and notice there verses 8 and 9. Also at the same time Solomon kept the feast 7 days, and all Israel with him, a very great congregation, from the entering in of Hamath unto the river of Egypt. And in the 8th day they made a solemn assembly, for they kept the dedication of the altar 7 days, and the feast 7 days. Go forward to the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah chapter 8. Nehemiah 8, and one verse there, verse 18. Also, day by day, from the first day unto the last day, he read in the book of the law of God, and they kept the feast 7 days, and on the 8th day was a solemn assembly, according unto the manner. Now, go forward to the book of Hosea. Right after the book of Daniel, Hosea chapter 9 and verses 5 and 6. What will ye do in the solemn day, and in the day of the feast of the Lord? For lo, they are gone because of destruction. Egypt shall gather them up. Memphis shall bury them. The pleasant places for their silver. Nettles shall possess them. Thorns shall be in their tabernacles. And also Hosea chapter 12, verse 9 says, "And I that am the Lord thy God from the land of Egypt will yet make thee to dwell in tabernacles as in the days of the solemn feast." Look at the last book of the Old Testament, Malachi, or Malachi if you're from Italy. Malachi chapter 4 and verse 2 says, "But unto you that fear my name shall the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his wings, and ye shall go forth and grow up as calves of the stall." Verse 4, "Remember ye the law of Moses, my servant, which I commanded unto him in Horeb for all Israel, with the statutes and judgments. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." We talked about the appearing of Moses and Elijah again in the tribulation, as undoubtedly the two witnesses. Go forward to Matthew chapter 17. Matthew 17. And let's read the first 4 verses there. Matthew 17. "And after 6 days Jesus taketh Peter, James, and John his brother, and bringeth them up into an high mountain apart, and was transfigured before them, and his face did shine as the sun, and his raiment was white as the light. And behold, there appeared unto them Moses and Elias talking with him. Then answered Peter and said unto Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If thou wilt, let us make here 3 tabernacles, one for thee, one for Moses, and one for Elias," indicating what time of the year that event took place. The Feast of Tabernacles, and a glimpse of Christ's future glory. Back in our text, verses 4 and 5, "For this was a statute for Israel and the law of the God of Jacob. This he ordained in Joseph for a testimony when he went out through the land of Egypt, where I heard a language that I understood not." Simply, Joseph and Jacob are both identified as Israel. Those 3 names are used interchangeably in those 2 verses. Verse 6, "I removed his shoulder from the burden, his hands were delivered from the pots." That should be self-explanatory. Back in Psalm 68, verse 13, we read, "Though ye have lain among the pots, yet shall ye be as the wings of a dove, covered with silver, and her feathers with yellow gold." Verse 7 says, "Thou callest in trouble, and I delivered thee. I answered thee in the secret place of thunder. I proved thee at the waters of Meribah, Selah." And like also back in Psalm 51, verse, let's see, Psalm 50. Psalm 50 and verse 15, God says to Israel, "Call upon me in the day of trouble, and I will deliver thee, and thou shalt glorify me." And Jeremiah 30, verse 7, makes it clear this tribulation is referred to as the time of Jacob's trouble. And Christ called it a time of tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. So all that is anticipating Jacob's future trouble, Israel's future trouble, the great tribulation. And here in verse 7 of our text, "Thou callest in trouble, and I deliver thee. I answer thee in the secret place of thunder." The secret place of thunder historically would be Mount Sinai. Exodus 19:16 said, "And it came to pass on the 3rd day in the morning that there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled." And then he repeats almost the same thing in Exodus 20, verse 18. Now, prophetically, it will be repeated again in the tribulation. Look back at 1 Samuel chapter 2. 1 Samuel 2, and 1 verse there, verse 10. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Out of heaven shall he thunder upon them. The Lord shall judge the ends of the earth. He shall give strength unto his king, and exalt the horns of his anointed. Revelation, well, we know it will be repeated in the tribulation, and we know that from one word in our text today. At the end of verse 7, that's the word Selah. All of the times we've run into that, it's tied almost immediately to some event pertaining to the tribulation, the end of the tribulation, the second coming, and the ensuing kingdom of Jesus Christ, the second advent of Jesus Christ. Revelation 16:18 tells us, and there were voices and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake and so great. Let's continue back in our Psalm 81. Let's pick up there, verse 8, down to verse 16. Hear, O my people, and I will testify unto thee, O Israel, if thou wilt hearken unto me. There shall no strange God be in thee, neither shalt thou worship any strange God. I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt. Open thy mouth wide, and I will fill it. But my people would not hearken to my voice, and Israel would none of me. So I gave them up unto their own heart's lust, and they walked in their own counsels. Oh, that my people had hearkened unto me, and Israel had walked in my ways. I should soon have subdued their enemies, and turned my hand against their adversaries. The haters of the Lord should have submitted themselves unto him, but their time should have endured forever. He should have fed them also with the finest of the wheat, and with honey out of the rock should I have satisfied thee. The Lord gives Israel a rebuke in this section of this psalm. And it was prefaced by verse 7, which said, I proved thee at the waters of Meribah, which is found recorded back in Exodus 17 in great detail, when the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron and against God because they had no water to drink. And when you consider the miracles that God performed just to keep their nation alive, for anyone to complain and to murmur and to quickly criticize God or complain against God's prophet and to murmur against God and find some reason to gripe, bellyache, you see what a stubborn and a stiff-necked and a rebellious people they always were and always have been, even to this day. When you consider the entire existence of the Jew and the Jewish race is just one continuous miracle after another. From the time they were first begun with Abraham's and Sarah, Abraham was 99 years old when he fathers Isaac, or 100 years old by the time Isaac's born, and Sarah up in her 90s probably at that time. From the very beginning of their race, it's been one continuous miracle after another just to preserve them, to protect them, to keep them alive, to make them successful, to give them favor, to raise them up or to lower them down, to humble them and punish them as need be, and to give them victory over their enemies, to help them survive in the times of plague, in times of famine, in times of hardship from country to country to country, to survive under different dominations by the Babylonians and the Persians, and then the Roman Empire, and all the battles of the Philistines, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and all of the tribes God was trying to get rid of in the land of Canaan. Their entire existence has been one continuous miracle after another. In fact, I don't suppose you could find any period in all of Israel's history from God calling Abraham, Genesis 12, until 2016, any time during the existence of the Jewish people where some miraculous hand of God's provision and protection hasn't been involved. Think about World War II. and the Holocaust of the Jews in the Nazi concentration camps and extermination camps, where you had an entire army, the most aggressive army in all of Europe, one of the most aggressive armies in the history of modern man, the Nazi Party, seeking to eliminate an entire race of other people, systematically, to capture them, to round them up, and to systematically murder them all, to wipe out their very existence wherever they could. And God kept them alive, and now the Nazi Party is no more, but the Jew just goes on. It's an amazing thing. Some of the most wicked and corrupt anti-Semites in history, who seemed to have all the authority at the time and could do what they wanted, have all fallen by the way, but the Jews survived. The most compelling proof to me that the Lord God of the Bible exists is the fact that the people of the Bible still exist.
Amen.
But when you consider all that, then Israel was certainly a rebellious and a disobedient nation. After seeing what God did in separating the waters at the Red Sea, and from one shoreline to the other shoreline is at least 5 miles. We have to think the idea of the Ten Commandments movie with Charlton Heston was a Hollywood special effects. And you can, I don't know if they still do it or not, we used to be able to ride that tram at Universal Studios, and they had that trick lake where the walls would come up, and then they'd separate like that, so that there'd be an open space in between where the tram would drive in between two sides of the water. And they said this was how they did that effect back during the making of that movie. But from one shoreline to the other was at least 5 miles, maybe close to 8 miles. I was looking in King James Bible I found at a thrift store the other day. Bible was great. I almost bought the Bible because it was a little larger print than the one I've been using, and I kind of like that. But I looked at the maps, and no Bible maps, except, well, maybe ours and for Bible believers, but generally speaking, no maps in the back of your Bible show Israel going across the Red Sea. They have them going around the Sinai Peninsula up where it's very shallow, what we call the Reed Sea, where it's just a trickle or a stream, and they say somehow that was powerful enough to wipe out the Egyptian army. No, it wasn't. But God said He made the waters a wall on either side of Israel. And Pharaoh and his 600 of his best chariots, plus other chariots and horsemen and soldiers, followed Israel right in. And when they were right in the middle of that part of the Red Sea, or that tongue, because there's 2 seas there, God closed in on them and drowned them all out. But no Bible maps, except for maybe those printed by Bible believers, no Bible maps show the route of the Exodus going through or across the Red Sea. They all have them dodging it somehow and going up where it's easy to traverse. But the Lord gives a rebuke in this section. He says, I prove thee at the waters of Meribah. And then in verse 8, hear, O my people. That's just as a little bit earlier in Psalm 78, verse 1, give ear, O my people, to my law, incline your ears to the words of my mouth. And nothing which follows here is very difficult. God says He will fill their mouths, according to verse 10, like a mother bird will fill the mouths of her offspring. Exodus 19:4 said, Ye have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself. Verses 11 and 12. But my people would not hearken to my voice, and Israel would none of me. So I gave them up unto their own heart's lust, and they walked in their own counsels. Now those verses are clear from Numbers chapter 11, if you want to go back there. Numbers 11. Numbers 11. And verses 18 to 21. Numbers 11 Start at verse 18. And say thou unto the people, sanctify yourselves against tomorrow, and ye shall eat flesh, for ye have wept in the ears of the Lord, saying, who shall give us flesh to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt, therefore the Lord will give you flesh, and ye shall eat. Ye shall not eat 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, neither 10 days, nor 20 days, but even a whole month, until it come out at your nostrils, and be loathsome unto you, because ye have despised the Lord which is among you, and have wept before him, saying, why came we forth out of Egypt? And Moses said, the people among whom I am are 600,000 footmen, and thou hast said, I will give them flesh, that they may eat a whole month. And they certainly did. But also notice that because of Israel's disobedience concerning verse 9 in our text, there shall no strange God be in thee, neither shalt thou worship any strange God. But because of their disobedience in that respect, God says that he gave them up later in verse 12. I want you to go back to Exodus chapter 20. Exodus 20, we're probably finished a little sooner than I intended today, but go to Exodus 20 and let's look at the second commandment, beginning there at verse 4. Takes up 3 verses here. Exodus 20, verse 4, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the 3rd and 4th generation, notice, of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me, and keep my commandments. I want you to add to that Psalm 135. Psalm 135. And let's begin there at verse 15. The idols of the heathen are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. They have mouths, but they speak not. Eyes have they, but they see not. They have ears, but they hear not. Neither is there any breath in their mouths. They that make them are like unto them. So is everyone that trusteth in them. And I've commented to you before that a real simple thing to take away from those 4 verses is that anybody who makes an image or a statue, even if they don't call it an idol, but they make an image to represent something in the great beyond, or someone in the great beyond, some person or some personality that statue depicts, and they're depending upon the statue, or they're kneeling down in front of the statue, or offering a prayer to the person that statue symbolizes. Any person who depends upon the statue for spiritual life is just as dead spiritually as that statue is. Mm-hmm. They that make them are like unto them. Imagine anything more mentally deficient than making something with your hands and then worshiping it. But some do. God says anyone who makes an image to kneel before it and worship is a hater of God. Exodus 20. Those them that hate me. So he mentions it in our text today, verse 15. The haters of the Lord should have submitted themselves unto him. And now there's an apparent contradiction found in verse 16 along with Deuteronomy 32. Go back to Deuteronomy first of all. Deuteronomy 32. And this one I did not include in my book of contradiction. There are so many, hundreds, that have been pointed out in the Scriptures, and yet upon close examination you'll realize there is no legitimate contradiction in any of the Bible. Everything harmonizes with the other text. If you just give it time and trust God to explain it to you. But notice there, Deuteronomy 32, and start at verse 11. As an eagle stirreth up her nest, fluttereth over her young, spreadeth abroad her wings, taketh them, beareth them on her wings, so the Lord alone did lead him. And there was no strange God with him. He made him ride on the high places of the earth, that he might eat the increase of the fields, and he made him to suck honey out of the rock, and oil out of the flinty rock, and so forth and so on. But notice verse 16 in our text. He should have fed them also with the finest of the wheat, and with honey out of the rock should I have satisfied thee. And it sounds like God saying he did, and on the other verse it says he didn't because of sin. There's really no contradiction. The reason is God did feed Israel, and it should have continued. He says in our text, verse 15, their time should have endured forever. But when the idolatry started, the blessings stopped. That's all you can take away from it. When the idolatry began, then the blessings ended. God takes that very seriously. And also verse 16, the contrast two words, the them, at the beginning of verse 6, near the beginning of verse 6, and then the word thee at the end. Them versus thee. That's the heathen around Israel versus Israel itself. But rather than the them or the other nations around them also being fed by God by trusting in the God of Israel and Jacob, they instead joined with the heathen in their idolatry and their worship of strange gods. He should have fed them, the Gentile nations, also with the finest of the wheat and with honey out of the rock, should I have satisfied thee. And it should have continued, as he says, it should have endured forever, verse 15. But God takes that kind of sin very seriously, the sin of idolatry, making an image to kneel before, to bow down, to symbolize. Now, there are some who are so worked up about the whole idea of an image that, in the case of Muslims, they're so worried about any image being made or drawn of Muhammad that they want you dead if you do so. And in some cases have murdered those who draw a picture of Muhammad. Even if you were to draw a picture depicting what they say is a true event in Muhammad's life, they would still take offense at it. No images are to be made of their prophet. Muhammad recommended drinking camel urine on a hot day. That's in their so-called hadith, the collection of sayings attributed to Muhammad. I don't suppose they'd appreciate you drawing an image of Muhammad with a cup of urine, or camel urine, in his hand. No, that'd be cause for death, cause for blasphemy, and so forth. Muhammad had multiple wives. His youngest was Aisha, and most famous because she was the youngest. He was betrothed or engaged to her with the help of her father when she was 6 years old. He was 30 at the time, and first went to bed with her when she was 9 years old. But to depict an image of Muhammad walking hand in hand with his wife, who's 6 or 7 years old or 9 years old, that would be cause for, law of, your death warrant. Yeah. That's blasphemy. So, but to an image or a picture depicting some, city father or your founders of your country in the city park, or a photo album of your relatives, some people go so far as to say you shouldn't even have pictures of people. I think you're getting a little bit carried away, because God had a qualifier. when he said, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image of anything in heaven or anything in earth, or anything that is under the earth or in the sea, to bow down thyself to them." That was the qualifier. So a statue of recognition or some painting as a record, before they had cameras, they would have oil paintings made of the different presidents, politicians, hanging in the White House and Capitol Rotunda and so forth. Go up to the state capitol here in California, and along the hallways you'll see oil paintings, portraits of all the different governors in California's history. And Governor Brown, there was a portrait done of him during his first time in office back in the 1970s. And Governor Moonbeam, he was called, because he was a real space cadet. He was way out there with the hippies and the free love people, and they paraded around Linda Ronstadt, who was a pop singer in those days, as his girlfriend. So he would be hip and cool in the eyes of all the younger voters he was depending on. But if you see his painting hanging in the wall, on the wall in the state capitol, it looks like a Picasso painting. It looks like something that's all misshapen. There's no real good definition to it. Somebody was finger painting when they put his portrait up on the wall there. Along all these nice, really professionally done artistic renderings, there's his painting there. But the idea of putting up a picture or a portrait or even a statue of some famous person out of recognition is not the same as creating an image for the purpose of spiritual worship. Now the Catholics try to get around that. They'll say God commanded not to make anything in heaven or earth or and so forth. And then he told them to make the cherubim on the top of the Ark of the Mercy seat, on the top of the Ark of the Covenant. So God contradicted himself. And of course, and see, they use that as justification for making their statues and their images of the Virgin Mary and all of the saints and so forth. But the qualifier was to make that image for the purpose of kneeling before it in worship. And if that was the purpose, then the statue was to be destroyed and the person put to death in the Old Testament. But Israel's rebellion against God, their joining in with the idolatry of the nations around them, caused the blessings of God and provisions of God to dry up, as well they should have. God takes it very seriously, and to think that we see the prophetic overtones in that psalm of Israel in the tribulation, many Jews will take the mark of the beast, and in so doing pledge their loyalty to the man of sin, who they will wrongly believe is their long-awaited Messiah, finally come to establish peace and give them dominion over the world. And he won't even give them dominion over the world. This is how twisted their understanding of their own scriptures will be. I can envision somebody, let's imagine the rapture takes place, all the true believers on the earth have suddenly disappeared, the world is thrust into panic and chaos, trying to understand what just happened. You saw how the world reacted on 9/11 in 2001, that whole post 9/11 world, as we call it now, with the attention on terrorism and so forth, consuming the news day after day. Well, imagine if tens or hundreds of millions of people disappeared off the earth suddenly, without explanation, without warning. Jesus said, "In an hour that you think not, the Son of Man cometh." So when that happens, every country will be affected to some degree or another. Those countries with a lot of believers living there, such as this one, will be affected more than some countries in remote parts of the world without a lot of believers. But every country will be affected to some degree. There will be believers and missionaries in Muslim countries and in Buddhist countries and Hindu countries that are suddenly gone. They'll wonder what happened to them. And why only the Christians? And then, of course, there will be people who had been saved but weren't living for Christ, and nobody knew they were a Christian. And then the counter argument will be, well, it wasn't just Christians that disappeared. There's a bunch of people who weren't Christians, and they're gone too, because nobody ever knew that they were saved. You see all the panic and the chaos and the confusion that will come about with that. And I can imagine that the United Nations and the European Union and the Pentagon and other organizations like those have already got plans on the drawing boards for such an eventuality, just in case some global catastrophe were to happen, all the stock markets were to collapse, and there's a worldwide depression once again. And by the way, some of the experts are predicting that. But so I'm sure they have plans on the drawing board that if such an event were to happen and affect every country in the world, we have a plan that we've been working on intended for just such an emergency. But it requires the suspension of national constitutions. It requires the suspension of national political bodies and their authority. The United States cannot have veto power over other nations at the UN and so forth. It requires that all of those rights are subordinated to this new plan. And the new plan has one man at the head of it and a select group under him governing the affairs of the world. 10 kings will reign with him. And the Club of Rome, as they say, has already got the world designated into 10 distinct regions over which they would all be governed. They would each have their own regional leader, each one of them answerable only to the worldwide leader, the man of sin, or the son of perdition, as he will be. And to make peace with everybody, Muslims will have to get in line. They'll have to behave themselves. Israel we're going to, first of all, let's solve this peace problem that's been a plague for centuries. Israel will finally get the temple they want, and the Muslims are going to have to move off the Temple Mount and do whatever has to be done with that Dome of the Rock. And they're going to have to get along with Israel. And they'll either do so or risk the united armies under the man of sin forcing them to do so. So all of that, I can see all of that happening, playing out. You know, let your imagination run wild, because you won't be too far off from the truth. And Israel will finally get the temple they've been wanting, and the leader who allows that to happen will be praised as their Messiah. They will have peace finally come. When Ezekiel said that there would one day be an invasion from the north upon a nation of unwalled villages, they'll take down those security walls, thinking peace has finally come. And of course they'll be making themselves more vulnerable to an attack by the Antichrist 3.5 years hence, 4 years hence, into the tribulation. And all of these things playing out. But you see all of that hinted at as you read through the Psalms. And I think I mentioned not long ago that we think of the minor prophets and the major prophets, as they're called. Minor simply meaning they're small books. Major prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, larger books. But the book of Psalms is usually included in the books of poetry. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Those 5 books are regarded as the books of poetry, or the books of wisdom. And yet the book of Psalms has to be one of the most prophetic books in all the Bible. It really does. And we've seen the future of Israel depicted time and time again, into 80, 81, 82 chapters nearly. So let's stop right there.